I'm going to talk about environmental impacts of warfare. I'm going to spell out the general problem, give some specific examples from American wars that we have mindlessly supported in my lifetime, and then talk about two big issues that are ticking away in the background. First, the general issue. The then UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said to a conference in 2014, the environment has long been a silent casualty of war and armed conflict. From the contamination of land and the destruction of forests, the plunder of natural resources and the collapse of management systems, the environmental consequences of war are often widespread and devastating. More recently, an article in The Guardian said, explaining how this happens, war changes our parameters. In the face of actual or perceived threat, acts that would normally be abhorrent become acceptable and even routine. One of the first of our sensibilities to be discarded in warfare is the protection of the environment, says Catherine Lutz, a professor on war and its impacts at the Watson Institute for International Studies. Let me give you three examples of direct impacts from American wars that we've been involved in. First, Afghanistan. The Costs of War project says illegal logging by US-backed warlords and wood harvesting by refugees caused more than 1/3 of Afghanistan's forests to vanish between 1990 and 2007. Drought, desertification, and species loss have resulted. The number of migratory birds passing through Afghanistan has fallen by 85%. And the permanent image I have from every TV report on the war in Afghanistan is never seeing a tree, never seeing a blade of grass, simply seeing sand and bare rock, basically because of the devastation that has followed during the war which we have mindlessly participated in. Secondly, Iraq. During the first Gulf War, the US bombed Iraq with 340 tons of missiles containing depleted uranium. And of course, radiation is a direct cancer threat to humans, and it's not good for animals as well. More generally, infrastructure damage led to pollution of water and air, sewage flowing into rivers, etc. Hundreds of oil wells were set on fire in this war, which we were led into by John Howard repeating the George W. Bush lie that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Of course, the reason that the coalition of the willing was able to steamroll Saddam Hussein's army was that he didn't have weapons of mass destruction. It was simply a barefaced lie. But we participated in this environmental destruction that was an inevitable consequence of that war. Thirdly, Vietnam. I recently visited Vietnam and I discovered that what we call the Vietnam War is known there as the American War, to differentiate it from the French War, in which the Vietnamese people fought off the colonial power and thought they had achieved independence until the United States of America decided that they didn't like who was likely to be in charge of an independent Vietnam and decided to start a civil war. And we mindlessly followed suit, being told by our then leaders that there was a domino theory that if Vietnam had a communist government, then communism would inevitably roll like a red tide south and engulf Australia. Sort of gravitational theory of politics, which has no obvious logic to it. Deforestation was widely practiced to try to interrupt the supply lines of Vietnamese fighters. And one environmental professor said recently, many of the trees in the tropical mangrove forests near the southernmost coast of South Vietnam were killed by a single spraying. It's estimated it will take up to a century for the mangrove forest to recover without reseeding. Since these and adjacent waters served as breeding and nursery grounds for wildlife, the area's entire ecology was catastrophically affected. And those problems remain to this day. And the use of Agent Orange was pretty bad for the humans who were there as well as for the environment. They're specific environmental issues that have resulted from American wars in which we participated. I now want to mention the two big issues which are ticking away in the background. The first is climate change. This graph of global mean temperature shows a trend that should be obvious to anyone who can read joined up writing and do takeaway sums, but has escaped the attention of some of our members of parliament. There is a clear trend, not just of increasing temperature, but of temperature increasing at an increasing rate. The Australian Academy of Science summed up the situation nearly a decade ago when they looked at the past record of fossil fuel combustion and release of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and the record of warming, and two alternative futures. The blue line is an optimistic future in which as a global community we get our act together, carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions peak in the next decade and then go steeply down so that we've decarbonised energy supply by the middle of this century. And the blue spread of curves shows the scientifically credible range of estimates of what that will mean in terms of increasing average global temperature. The good news is that it is still scientifically credible that we could keep the increase in average global temperature below 2 degrees, but it would require concerted action starting yesterday. The red curve is the business as usual trajectory of increasing quantities of greenhouse gases being released into the atmosphere, driven by people suggesting, for example, that the recovery from COVID requires burning increasing amounts of gas, or even in some of the more deranged corners of Parliament, public subsidies of new coal-fired power stations. The red curve shows what would be the carbon dioxide trajectory if there wasn't concerted action. And on the bottom graph, that spread shows the scientifically credible range of estimates of what that would mean in terms of average global temperature. And basically what it says is at the moment, we're on course for 3 or 4 degrees increase in average global temperature. And that's average. I remind you that the average global temperature has now increased by about 1 degree, but the average temperature in places like Central Australia has increased by 2.5 degrees because of the old primary school geography maxim that climate is determined by latitude, altitude, and nearness to the sea. Basically, as you get further inland, the climate is not moderated by the ocean. It's colder in winter and hotter in summer. So basically, we are on track for a catastrophic future. How does the military contribute to this? Well, the point is that the military is a very large consumer of fossil fuels. A recent article in The Guardian pointed out that the US Department of Defense is the country's largest consumer of fossil fuels. 2007, nearly 15 years ago, the military used 20 billion litres of fuel each year. So the US military alone releases similar amounts of carbon dioxide to a mid-sized European country such as Denmark. And that's before they go to war, as The Guardian said. The carbon footprint of the deployed modern army is typically enormous. One report suggested the US military was using nearly 200 million litres of oil every month during the invasion of Iraq. And it's used very wastefully. It's estimated that 2/3 of the fuel was used to deliver fuel to the vehicles at the battlefront, rather than to do anything useful like murdering people. So as well as having direct environmental impacts like deforestation, pollution of air and water, the military is a very significant contributor to the problem of worsening climate change. The other big issue is nuclear weapons. The world has made some progress, but there's still an estimated arsenal of over 13,000 nuclear weapons, of which more than 3,000 are primed, ready for use. Using only a few would render entire regions uninhabitable. 50 nations have now endorsed a UN treaty saying that nuclear weapons should be eliminated. Australia, to our shame, has not signed that UN treaty. And it's sometimes argued that we don't sign it because we implicitly rely on the nuclear weapons of the United States of America to defend us. Let me just make a point about the morality of defense based on nuclear weapons. When a deranged individual holds a small group of people hostage and threatens to murder them unless their wishes are granted, we are rightly horrified, and our police forces respond with all of the force they can assemble to silence this obviously unacceptable threat to a small number of innocent civilians. A defense policy based on nuclear weapons is essentially saying we will murder millions of innocent civilians if our wishes are not granted. And that is clearly morally indefensible on a huge scale. So the final point, warfare has disastrous local, small-scale environmental impacts. There are too many recent examples to document. I simply picked three from three recent US wars in which Australia has been involved. And in each of those cases, I could have given more examples of the environmental damage that resulted from the warfare. As well as those local environmental impacts of warfare, the military is involved in the two existential threats to human civilization. Military use of fossil fuels is a significant contributor to climate change, and we have the continuing threat of nuclear weapons, a small fraction of the arsenal of which would render entire regions uninhabitable. The conclusion is that the military is a very significant environmental threat, and a world in which we disarmed, a world in which there was less warfare, a world in which nuclear weapons were not deployed, and in which the military was not charging around burning huge amounts of fossil fuels, would be better for the environment as well as better for human civilization.